The morning of April 16, 1945, USS Laffey, designated DD-724, holds Station Number 1 in the radar picket line, 57 nautical miles north of Okinawa's bloodied coast. Lieutenant Frank Manson stands at his battle station, commanding the forward 5-inch mount, and watches the grey horizon through salt-crusted optical sights. The air tastes like cordite and machinery oil. His gun crew has been at quarters since 0600, and they've already sent 2 Japanese aircraft spiralling into the Pacific before 0800. Now radar reports 22 more inbound, converging from multiple vectors. Manson's ready magazine holds 180 rounds of what the Navy calls special ammunition shells, with peculiar fuses screwed into their noses, fuses that cost more than some sailors earn in a month, fuses that carry a secret the Japanese have never discovered despite 18 months of dying to them. The secret is this: every shell carries an invisible sphere of death, 140 feet in diameter, and the Japanese pilots diving toward his ship have no idea they're already flying through kill zones they cannot see, cannot hear, cannot evade. This is the story of the weapon that rewrote the mathematics of naval warfare, and how an entire enemy air force died without ever understanding what killed them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The proximity fuse, officially designated VT for variable time, though that name is deliberate misdirection, represents something unprecedented in the history of warfare. It is a shell that doesn't need to hit anything, it only needs to get close. Inside a space smaller than a Coca-Cola bottle sits a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, a battery that arms itself through centrifugal force, vacuum tubes no larger than pencil erasers, and a firing circuit calibrated to detonate when reflected radio signals indicate the shell has passed within lethal range of something metallic, something like an aircraft's aluminum skin, something like the cockpit where a pilot sits, unaware that his own airplane is reflecting the signal that will trigger his death. The weapon emerged from a collaboration between British and American scientists working under extraordinary secrecy. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the Carnegie Institution, the National Bureau of Standards, and Britain's Telecommunications Research Establishment all contributed to solving a problem that seemed, in 1940, nearly impossible: how to fit a functional radio transmitter and receiver into a projectile that would experience 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired, survive temperatures ranging from sub-zero magazine storage to the heat of gun barrel friction, operate reliably in salt spray and violent weather, and cost little enough to manufacture by the tens of thousands. The physics were elegant. The engineering was brutal. A standard 5-inch shell leaves the gun barrel at 2,600 feet per second, spinning at 500 revolutions per second from the rifling grooves. The acceleration forces would liquefy human tissue. Standard vacuum tubes, the electronic components that made radio possible in the 1940s, shattered under such stress. The solution required developing entirely new tube designs with reinforced filaments, shock-mounted elements, and glass envelopes that could withstand impacts that would destroy conventional electronics. Then came the power problem. The fuse needed electricity, but conventional batteries couldn't survive the firing shock. The answer was a battery that armed itself during flight. As the shell spun, centrifugal force closed switches and activated circuits, transforming a dormant component into an active transmitter within the first second of flight. The battery delivered power for 20 to 40 seconds. The typical flight time of an anti-aircraft shell then exhausted itself. If the shell failed to detonate, A self-destruct mechanism crushed the vacuum tubes and critical circuits after 60 seconds, rendering the technology unrecoverable even if the enemy retrieved the dud. Security protocols for the proximity fuse bordered on paranoia. Designated special ammunition, the fuses arrived at ships in locked containers requiring 2 officers' signatures to open. Gun crews were forbidden from examining them. If a fuse-equipped shell misfired and landed intact, the ship's commanding officer was required to mark the exact coordinates and transmit them encrypted to naval salvage teams. Most critically, never fire proximity-fuzed shells over land where duds might be recovered by enemy forces. The risk that Japan might capture an intact fuse outweighed any tactical advantage. Every fuse carried a self-destruct mechanism, but regulations assumed mechanisms could fail. The Japanese could not learn this weapon existed. Understanding why requires understanding the state of anti-aircraft warfare before the proximity fuse changed everything. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. American anti-aircraft gunners across Oahu fired more than 8,000 rounds at attacking Japanese aircraft during the 2-hour assault. Hit rate, less than 1%. The mathematics were simply brutal. A 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, to destroy an aircraft using a conventional contact fuse, had to physically strike the target, a direct hit on a machine traveling 300 miles per hour or faster, often maneuvering evasively, at ranges between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, with the shell itself traveling a ballistic arc affected by wind, humidity, temperature, and the motion of the firing ship. Hitting such a target was like shooting a sparrow with a rifle while standing on a rocking platform. The standard solution was barrage fire. Fill the sky with steel and hope. If you fired enough shells into a bomber's projected flight path, probability suggested some would connect. In practice, this meant American and British gunners stood exposed on deck, feeding ammunition continuously, while enemy pilots selected their targets and attack angles. Barrage fire worked, sometimes, if you had enough ammunition, enough time, and enough gun crews who could maintain fire discipline while bombs and torpedoes struck around them. The problem wasn't marksmanship. The problem was geometry. A 5-inch shell's explosive charge, when it detonated on contact, produced a fragment pattern roughly 30 feet in diameter, deadly to anything within that radius, less effective beyond it. To guarantee a kill, the shell had to pass within 15 feet of the target. At typical engagement ranges, with target speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour and contemporary fire control systems predicting target position based on optical tracking or early radar, achieving 15-foot accuracy required either exceptional skill or exceptional luck. Proximity fuzzes changed the geometry. Instead of needing 15-foot accuracy, gunners needed only 140-foot accuracy. The kill zone expanded by a factor of nearly 10. Instead of needing a direct hit, gunners needed only to place the shell somewhere in the target's general vicinity. The mathematics of probability shifted dramatically in favor of the defenders. But more than that, and this is the irony at the heart of this story, the proximity fuse worked best when the enemy didn't know it existed. Traditional anti-aircraft fire created visible patterns, streams of tracers, clusters of shell bursts, concentrations of fire around predicted positions. All these things taught pilots where the danger zones were and how to evade them. Experienced aviators learned to read the sky, to see where gunners were concentrating fire, and to avoid those zones. Anti-aircraft warfare became a game of prediction and counter-prediction, gunners trying to predict where the aircraft would be, pilots trying to evade the predicted zones. Proximity fuses eliminated the pattern. A single shell, passing anywhere near the target, was lethal. There was no concentration of fire to read, no pattern to evade. To Japanese pilots watching their formation mates disappear in midair from shells that seemed to miss, it looked like American accuracy had become supernatural. Shells that shouldn't have hit anything were killing aircraft. Some Japanese pilots reported this phenomenon. Those who survived did, at least. Imperial Navy intelligence officers collected descriptions of new American explosive shells that didn't require direct hits. But without physical evidence, without recovered fuse components, they couldn't determine the mechanism. Their speculation ranged across multiple theories: altitude-triggered detonators, acoustic sensors responding to engine noise, infrared detection of engine heat, or simply larger explosive charges producing wider fragment patterns. They guessed everything except the truth. Japanese signals intelligence, by 1944, had become among the world's most sophisticated. They had broken American diplomatic codes before Pearl Harbor. Their radio intercept stations monitored every frequency the American military used. Their direction-finding networks tracked fleet movements across the Pacific, but they were listening for communications, for voice transmissions and Morse code, for the patterns of military radio traffic. They never realized that American anti-aircraft shells were broadcasting. Each proximity fuse transmitted continuously during its 20 to 40 seconds of flight, sending out radio waves at frequencies specifically chosen to reflect off metal surfaces. The signals were too brief, too localized, too embedded in the radio chaos of naval combat to register as meaningful. The Japanese heard the noise but never decoded the message. Their listening stations picked up the transmissions but dismissed them as interference, as atmospheric effects, as the electromagnetic hash produced by ships' radar sets and electronic equipment. The shells were screaming their presence to anyone listening on the right frequency. But no one was listening for a shell to transmit. Lieutenant Commander William Sterling Parsons understood this better than most. Born in Chicago in 1901, Parsons entered the Naval Academy in 1918, wanting to be a scientist, not a warrior. But the Navy of the 1930s needed officers who could bridge two worlds, the world of naval tradition and the emerging world of electronic warfare and advanced ordnance. By 1940, Parsons had become precisely that, a gunnery officer who understood physics, an engineer who understood tactics. In early 1943, he received an assignment to Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. His task? Make the proximity fuse work reliably in the maritime environment. The fuse had been tested, refined, and proven in land-based anti-aircraft use. But ships moved. Ships vibrated continuously from engine and sea motion. Ships faced salt spray that corroded electronics, temperature extremes from tropical heat to North Atlantic cold, and the violent recoil forces of 5-inch guns that could snap a man's spine if he stood in the wrong place when they fired. Parsons supervised modifications for naval deployment, waterproof seals, corrosion-resistant coatings, impact-hardened components, and revised self-destruct mechanisms that would function even in seawater. Each fuse cost $18 in 1943 currency, roughly $280 in contemporary terms compared to $1.50 for a standard contact fuse. But if the proximity fuse worked as designed, a single round could accomplish what 50 conventional shells might not. The first confirmed shipboard kill using proximity fuzzes occurred on August 18, 1943. USS Helena, a Street Louis-class light cruiser, was operating off the Solomon Islands when radar detected a Japanese Mitsubishi G4M bomber Allied reporting name Betty approaching at 8,000 feet. Traditional doctrine called for barrage fire, continuous shooting, walking shells through the target's projected path until something connected. Helena's gun crews fired 4 rounds. The first shell passed 200 feet beneath the bomber, no detonation too far for the fuse's detection range. The second shell, 150 feet away, still no detonation. The third shell passed within 120 feet of the bomber's fuselage. The aircraft disintegrated. No visible impact, no shell strike on the wing or engine or tail. The Betty simply came apart in midair as if struck by an invisible fist, pieces tumbling through 8,000 feet into the Pacific below. The fourth shell, already in flight when the bomber broke apart, detonated 90 feet from the expanding debris cloud. Chief Gunner's mate Robert Keyes, a Navy veteran since 1935, filed a patrol report that captured the moment. Like the hand of God reached up and swatted it. No impact observed. Aircraft broke apart under conditions inconsistent with standard shell performance. The wreckage fell into deep water, no pieces large enough for Japanese salvage vessels to recover. No evidence of the killing mechanism survived. Word of the new fuses spread through Pacific Fleet channels, but slowly, constrained by classification. Gun crews received minimal explanation. These are special shells, don't examine them, don't talk about them, don't fire them over land under any circumstances. The crews obeyed, mostly because the results spoke for themselves. Aircraft that should have required 70, 80, 100 rounds to destroy were falling to 3 or 4 proximity-fuzed shells. By January 1944, VT-fuzed ammunition had become standard issue across the Pacific Fleet's screening cruisers and destroyers. Average rounds per kill statistics began dropping precipitously, from approximately 400 rounds per aircraft destroyed down to 60, then to 30 by mid-1944. Some engagements achieved ratios of 10-to-1 or better. The weapon was performing beyond initial projections, but something unexpected was happening. Something that revealed just how completely the Japanese remained ignorant of the new technology. Japanese tactics weren't changing. Captain Arleigh Burke, commanding Destroyer Squadron 23, nicknamed the Little Beavers, noted the phenomenon in his after-action report from the Battle of Cape Street. George, November 25, 1943. Enemy aircraft pressed attacks using identical approach vectors and altitudes observed in previous engagements despite losing 80% of strike force before weapon release. No indication of tactical adaptation to improved defensive capability. Assessment. Enemy unaware of proximity kill mechanism. The Japanese kept flying the same patterns, using the same approach angles, maintaining the same attack altitudes. They weren't adapting because they couldn't see what was killing them. Traditional anti-aircraft fire created feedback. Pilots saw tracer streams, saw shell bursts clustering around targets, saw the patterns of defensive fire and learned to evade, but proximity-fuzed shells left no pattern to read. A single round, anywhere in the vicinity, was lethal. The Japanese pilots watched their formation mates explode from shells that appeared to miss and concluded that American accuracy had improved dramatically. They couldn't realize that American accuracy had become irrelevant. The shells no longer needed to be accurate. They only needed to be close. Some Japanese pilots who survived reported the phenomenon to Imperial Navy intelligence. Their reports described new American shells that exploded near aircraft without direct contact, that seemed to know when they were close to targets, that created larger than expected kill zones. Intelligence officers collected these reports, filed them, and tried to analyze them. But without physical evidence, without captured fuse components, they couldn't reverse engineer the mechanism. Their theories multiplied: larger explosive charges, improved shrapnel dispersion, altitude-sensitive triggers, acoustic detection systems, infrared seekers responding to engine heat. Every theory was wrong, not because Japanese engineers lacked competence, but because they were solving the wrong problem. They were trying to explain how a shell could know when it was close to a target, without assuming the shell was actively measuring that distance using reflected radio waves. The possibility simply didn't occur to them. Why would it? Radar was massive, ship-mounted equipment requiring multiple operators and substantial power supplies. The idea that radar principles could be miniaturized into a shell fuse, could survive the firing shock, could operate for 40 seconds on a self-arming battery, it seemed impossible. More impossible than acoustic triggers or infrared sensors or any of the other theories Japanese intelligence pursued. So Japanese aviators kept dying without knowing why. They pressed attacks with courage that bordered on fatalism, accepting catastrophic losses to deliver torpedoes and bombs against American ships. As the war progressed into late 1944, Japanese naval aviation embraced an even more desperate tactic: deliberate crash attacks. If you're going to die anyway, and by late 1944, most Japanese pilots understood that survival odds were minimal, crash into something valuable. Make your death count. The tactic received official sanction in October 1944. Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, Special Attack Units. The Western Allies called them Kamikazes, Divine Wind, after the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in ancient times. The concept was simple. Aircraft became guided missiles, pilots became guidance systems. Death became a tactical choice rather than a statistical probability. Against conventional anti-aircraft defenses, kamikaze tactics were brutally effective. The mathematics of interception changed when pilots stopped trying to survive. A bomber approaching at high altitude, releasing weapons from maximum safe range, could be engaged for several minutes as it flew its attack profile. A kamikaze diving from altitude, accepting any amount of damage as long as the aircraft remained controllable long enough to reach the target, compressed engagement time to seconds. Gun crews didn't have time for barrage fire, didn't have time to adjust aim, barely had time to track targets before impact. Proximity fuses changed that equation. A kamikaze diving at 400 miles per hour, willing to absorb damage that would make conventional pilots abort, still couldn't evade geometry. The aircraft still reflected radio waves. The fuse still measured distance and detonated at 140 feet. The pilot's courage, his willingness to die, his determination to hit the target, none of it mattered if the shell detonated close enough to destroy the aircraft's control surfaces, kill the pilot in his seat, or simply tear the airplane apart before it reached release range. The kamikazes made proximity fuses even more valuable, and the Japanese never understood why their new tactics were failing at rates they hadn't anticipated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of Samar, October 25, 1944, revealed just how profoundly the proximity fuse had shifted naval warfare's basic geometry and how completely the Japanese misunderstood that shift. Taffy 3, officially Escort Carrier Group 77.4.3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. They were providing air support for the Leyte landings, operating northeast of Samar Island under the assumption that Admiral Halsey's battleships were covering the northern approaches. Halsey wasn't there. He'd taken the bait, chasing Japanese carrier decoys north, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. At 06:45, Taffy 3's radar detected surface contacts emerging from the strait. 23 Japanese warships, 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. The center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, carrying guns that outranged anything the Americans possessed, displacing more tonnage than the entire escort carrier group combined. On paper, it should have been a massacre. Yamato alone displaced 72,000 tons, more than all 6 escort carriers together. Her 18.1-inch guns could strike from 25 miles away. The escort carrier's 5-inch guns were designed for shore bombardment and anti-aircraft work, not ship-to-ship combat. Their shells would barely scratch Yamato's armor. But the escort carriers carried proximity-fuzed ammunition. USS White Plains, call sign White Pawn, opened fire at 07:23 as Japanese cruiser Tone closed to 19,000 yards. Commander Dennis J. Sullivan, the ship's gunnery officer, understood his 5-inch mounts couldn't hurt Tone directly. The cruiser's armor belt was too thick, her compartmentation too sophisticated to be damaged by the relatively light shells his guns fired. But Tone was launching spotter aircraft. Type 0 observation float planes, launched by catapult from the cruiser's stern, were climbing to altitude to direct the battleship's fire. These spotters were what made Yamato's guns accurate at extreme range. Without aerial observation, the Japanese battleships would be firing nearly blind, relying on optical range-finding at distances where atmospheric haze and Earth curvature made accurate targeting almost impossible. Kill the spotters, and the overwhelming Japanese gunnery advantage diminished significantly. White Plains gun crews fired 14 proximity-fuzed rounds in 90 seconds. 3 float planes fell from the sky, no direct hits. The shells detonated close enough that blast waves ripped fabric control surfaces from wings, shattered aluminum structural members, killed observers in open cockpits, or simply knocked the ungainly float planes into unrecoverable spins. Other escort carriers followed White Plains' example. Within 10 minutes, every Japanese spotter aircraft launched from the center force had been destroyed. The battleships and cruisers, denied aerial observation, had to rely on their own fire, a control sophisticated by any standard, but limited by horizon distance and atmospheric effects. Here's where the irony becomes perfect. The Japanese, watching their spotter aircraft fall to what appeared to be accurate anti-aircraft fire from small escort carriers, drew a logical conclusion. These carriers had better anti-aircraft capability than expected. Therefore, an aerial attack would be high risk. Therefore, close range and engage with surface gunnery, where Japanese advantages in armor, tonnage, and gun caliber were overwhelming. The Japanese closed. What they couldn't realize without understanding proximity fuses, was that the same weapon defending against aircraft could disrupt surface attack. Not through damage to armored warships, 5-inch shells weren't going to hurt a battleship, but by killing observation aircraft, the proximity fuses forced Japanese ships to close to visual range. That meant entering torpedo range. That meant accepting harassment from destroyers and destroyer escorts, whose proximity-fuzed anti-aircraft fire also threatened any attempt to launch additional spotter aircraft. The mathematics of the engagement shifted in ways the Japanese couldn't see. They thought they were closing to exploit their surface gunnery advantage. They were actually negating it by accepting shorter engagement ranges where American torpedoes and close-range tactics could offset Japanese firepower superiority. White planes survived. The entire task unit survived. Not because they won the surface gun duel they couldn't, but because the Japanese admirals never understood they were fighting against a weapon that had changed the fundamental parameters of naval combat. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force, withdrew at 09:11. His action report cited fierce resistance from enemy air and surface forces and concern about American carrier aircraft returning from strikes elsewhere. The proximity fuse doesn't appear in his assessment. How could it? He had no conceptual framework for understanding that American anti-aircraft shells were measuring their distance to targets using reflected radio signals. The mechanism was outside his experience, outside his intelligence briefs, outside the realm of what seemed technically possible in 1944. So, the center force withdrew. 4 escort carriers had been sunk or damaged. Gambier Bay sunk by gunfire, Kalinin Bay heavily damaged, Fanshawe Bay hit multiple times. Street, low destroyed by Kamikaze after the surface action ended, but the Leyte invasion continued. The Japanese fleet's last major offensive thrust had failed, partly through tactical choices, partly through aggressive American destroyer attacks, and partly through a weapon one side possessed and the other side never understood. By April 1945, when USS Laffey took her position on Radar Picket Station 1 north of Okinawa, the proximity fuse had been in service for nearly 2 years. Hundreds of thousands had been manufactured. They'd been fired in every major Pacific naval engagement since mid-1943. Japanese intelligence had collected countless pilot reports describing near-miss kills, shells that exploded without impact, defensive fire that seemed impossibly accurate. And the Japanese still didn't understand how they worked. 4 unexploded proximity-fuzzed shells had been recovered by Japanese forces. All 4 came from violations of security protocol. American forces firing over land in the Philippines, where dud shells fell into areas the Japanese subsequently controlled. Japanese engineers examined these duds carefully, documented everything they found. What they found was crushed vacuum tubes, shattered circuit components, and discharged batteries. The self-destruct mechanisms had functioned as designed. Without intact samples, reverse engineering was impossible. Japanese engineers could see that something electronic had been present, could identify vacuum tube fragments, could recognize battery components, but they couldn't determine the circuit design, couldn't understand the function, couldn't reverse engineer the triggering mechanism from destroyed parts. They knew the shells were electronic. They knew the shells responded to proximity. They couldn't figure out how. So on April 16, 1945, when Laffey's radar detected 22 Kamikaze aircraft inbound on Radar Picket Station 1, the Japanese pilots flying those aircraft were diving to their deaths against a defensive system they'd never understood despite 18 months of dying to it. The morning was overcast. Scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, visibility 8 miles, sea state moderate with 6-foot swells. Laffey had been at general quarters since 0600, her crew at battle stations, her magazines fully loaded with both conventional and proximity-fuzed ammunition. Being on radar picket duty meant being the first target. The kamikazes would hit the picket destroyers before they reached the main fleet. Everyone aboard knew this. The statistical life expectancy of a radar picket destroyer off Okinawa was measured in days, not weeks. At 0827, radar contact. Multiple bogies, bearing 350, range 12 miles, closing fast. The Combat Information Center identified them as hostile Japanese aircraft, probably part of Kikusui 6, the sixth mass kamikaze operation against the Okinawa invasion fleet. Lieutenant Frank Manson commanded Mount 51, the forward 5-inch dual-purpose mount. His crew consisted of 13 men: pointer, trainer, fuse setter, shell men, powder men, rammer, hot shell man. They'd been at quarters for 2.5 hours. They were tired before the fight began. At 08:30, Laffy opened fire. Mount 51 engaged an Aichi D-3A dive bomber, Allied code name VAL, approaching from ahead at 10,000 feet. Standard procedure for proximity-fuzed ammunition: fire into the projected flight path. Let the fuses handle the geometry. Manson's crew fired 3 rounds. The VAL disintegrated at 8,000 feet, pieces spinning into the ocean. 1 down, 21 to go. At 08:31, a Nakajima B-6N torpedo bomber Jill in Allied code approached from the starboard quarter at 12,000 feet, 4 rounds. The Jill exploded in midair at 9,000 feet, no impact visible. The proximity fuse had detonated close enough that the blast wave tore the aircraft apart. 2 down, 20 to go. At 08:33, 2 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers Judies dove from 14,000 feet, 1 from port bow, 1 from starboard bow. Coordinated attack, trying to split the defensive fire. Mount 51 engaged the port target. 5 rounds, walking the shells through the dive path. The Judy exploded at 6,000 feet. Mount 53 got the starboard target at 4,000 feet. 3 rounds, 4 down, 18 to go. This is where the mathematics of proximity fuzzes became most visible. Traditional anti-aircraft fire against diving targets required leading the target, predicting where it would be when the shell arrived, accounting for the aircraft's acceleration as it dove, adjusting for wind and humidity, and a dozen other variables. Hit probability was low, required time, required multiple shells to bracket the target. Proximity fuzzes simplified it. Fire into the dive path. The shell will tell you if it gets close. If it does, it'll kill. No need for perfect accuracy. No need to hit. Just need to get the shell near enough. At 08:36, 3 Mitsubishi A6M Fighters Zeros strafed Laffy at low level, while 2 more VALs dove from altitude. The strafing run was cover for the bombers, trying to suppress the anti-aircraft guns. Mount 51 couldn't depress low enough to engage the strafing Zeros but stayed on the diving VALs. 7 rounds took down both bombers before they reached release altitude. 6 down, 16 to go. At 08:40, the first Kamikaze hit Laffy. A VAL that had approached through scattered clouds, undetected until it emerged at 3,000 feet directly above the ship. Mount 51 couldn't traverse fast enough. The VAL struck Mount 53, destroying the gun and killing most of the crew. Secondary explosions from ready ammunition killed men on the exposed deck. Mount 51 kept firing. At 08:42, Judy dove from the starboard beam. 4 rounds. The aircraft exploded at 2,000 feet, but burning wreckage continued down and struck Laffy's stern, starting fires in the aft crew compartments. At 08:45, 2 Zeros crashed into Laffy's superstructure within seconds of each other. 1 hit the deckhouse, penetrating to the wardroom. 1 hit the aft deckhouse, destroying fire control equipment. The ship was burning from multiple hits, listing 3 degrees to port, losing steering control. Mount 51 kept firing. At 08:48, a bomb-carrying Zero hit the port 20mm gun mount. The bomb detonated inside the ship, blowing a hole in the port side large enough to walk through. Flooding began in 3 compartments. At 0850, Judy dove on Laffey's bow. Manson's crew, working through smoke and flames, fired 6 proximity-fuzed rounds. Judy exploded at 800 feet. Pieces of the aircraft struck the forward deck but started no new fires. At 0851, another valve struck the ship amidships, its bomb exploding in the forward engine room. The explosion killed everyone in the space and flooded the compartment. Laffey lost half her power. Speed dropped to 15 knots, then 10. Mount 51 kept firing. They'd exhausted their proximity-fuzed ammunition at 0852. Manson's crew switched to conventional contact-fuzed shells. The difference was immediate and brutal. Against aircraft that had been falling to 3 or 4 proximity-fuzed rounds, conventional shells required 10, 15, 20 rounds to score kills when they scored kills at all. The geometry had reverted to its pre-1943 state. You had to hit the target. Near misses didn't count. Between 0852 and 0920, 10 more kamikazes approached Laffey. Manson's crew fired 63 conventional rounds. They scored 2 confirmed hits, 2 aircraft destroyed, 8 aircraft attacked other destroyers or withdrew after expending ammunition on strafing runs. At 0922, the attack ended. Laffey was burning from bow to stern, listing 7 degrees to port, dead in the water. 32 men were dead, 71 wounded. 5 of 6 5-inch mounts were destroyed or inoperable. The ship should have sunk. She didn't. Damage control parties contained the flooding. Fire parties extinguished the blazes. The after-engine room, though damaged, remained operational enough to provide minimal power. By 1100 hours, Laffey was making 3 knots under her own power. Destroyers Macomb and Barton provided anti-aircraft cover and prepared towing gear, but Laffey made it to Hagushi anchorage under her own power by late afternoon. 80 minutes of combat, 22 attacking aircraft, 5 direct kamikaze hits, 3 near misses close enough to cause damage, and she survived. The proximity fuse had created a defensive advantage sufficient that even after 5 successful attacks that penetrated the defensive fire, the ship remained afloat. Here's what the Japanese pilots couldn't know, even as they pressed their attacks through defensive fire that killed 14 of 22 aircraft before they reached release points. Every shell that detonated near their aircraft was detonating because their aircraft's aluminum skin reflected a radio signal back to the shell. The very material that made their aircraft light enough to fly was triggering their own deaths. They were flying reflective surfaces through an invisible field of radio-transmitting projectiles, each projectile measuring the distance to their cockpits, counting down the meters 140 feet, 130, 120, until the fuse fired and high explosives drove steel fragments outward at 4,000 feet per second. They couldn't hear the radio signals, couldn't detect them with their instruments, couldn't evade them because you can't evade geometry. Some proximity spheres intersected with aircraft, most didn't, but enough did that 14 kamikazes died before delivering their attacks, and only 8 got through to hit the ship. The mathematics favored the defenders. The Japanese didn't understand why. Laffey's commanding officer, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton, later described the engagement in his action report. The proximity fuse proved decisive in reducing casualties from massed kamikaze attack. Without this ammunition, the ship would certainly have been sunk with total loss of crew. Estimate that conventional anti-aircraft fire would have achieved no more than 4 to 6 kills against this attack profile. Actual kills using proximity fuse: 14 confirmed, 3 probable. Recommend continued high-priority production and distribution. The report was classified secret. The proximity fuse remained classified. The official press release described Laffey's defense as accurate and sustained anti-aircraft fire. The weapon that saved 304 men remained nameless in public records. The Japanese, analyzing the loss of 22 aircraft against a single destroyer, concluded that American radar-directed fire control had improved beyond initial assessments. Their countermeasure, larger attack formations, coordinated from multiple vectors, overwhelming the radar systems and fire control computers through sheer numbers. They never understood that radar wasn't the critical component. The critical component was the $18 radio transmitter screwed into the nose of every shell, measuring distance in real time, detonating when reflection strength indicated lethal proximity. By May 1945, proximity fuses were accounting for approximately 50% of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by shipboard anti-aircraft fire in the Pacific Theater. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance estimated that VT fuses reduced ammunition expenditure per kill by 85% compared to conventional barrage fire. But the true impact was strategic, not statistical. Kamikaze tactics required surprise, speed, and determination to succeed. The proximity fuse eliminated surprise. Japanese strike aircraft approaching American task forces faced defensive fire that didn't need to see them clearly, didn't need perfect tracking solutions, and didn't need direct hits. The shells only needed to get close. That changed everything. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding amphibious forces at Okinawa, assessed the weapon's impact in his May 15th action report. The proximity fuse has proven decisive in reducing casualties from kamikaze attack. Without this weapon, losses to Task Force 51 would have been catastrophic. Current kill ratios would be impossible to achieve using conventional ammunition. The fuse represents the single most important technological advantage in anti-aircraft warfare. Casualties weren't eliminated. 188 American ships were damaged or sunk by kamikazes at Okinawa. Nearly 5,000 sailors died. But the VT fuse created enough defensive advantage that the kamikaze strategy failed strategically. Japan couldn't sustain the aircraft losses required to overcome proximity fuse defenses. By June 1945, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. The kamikazes had expended themselves against defenses they never understood. The weapon designed to defend ships ended up defending the invasion timeline itself. The proximity fuse remained classified until September 1945, weeks after Japan's surrender. Only then did Navy researchers begin examining captured Japanese documents and interviewing intelligence officers. What they found confirmed battlefield observations. Japan never determined how the fuses worked. Japanese engineers had speculated extensively. Their theories included altitude-triggered detonators, acoustic sensors responding to engine noise, infrared detection systems tracking engine heat, and enhanced explosive charges producing wider fragment patterns. Every theory was logical given the observed effects. Every theory was wrong. Some theories came close. Japanese engineers correctly surmised that the fuses must be measuring distance somehow and must be detecting proximity to aircraft, but they couldn't determine the mechanism. Radar seemed impossible to miniaturize. Acoustic systems couldn't work at the speeds involved. Infrared detection required line of sight and couldn't function through clouds. They were left with theories that explained some effects but not all. The 4 recovered VT-fused shells, The duds that fell on land in the Philippines provided physical evidence but not understanding. Japanese engineers documented crushed vacuum tubes, recognized electronic components, and identified battery fragments. But the self-destruct mechanisms had functioned as designed. Critical circuits were destroyed, vacuum tubes were shattered, the battery was discharged and corroded. Without intact samples, reverse engineering the circuit design from fragments was impossible. One Japanese engineer's report, captured after the war, described the situation precisely. The device clearly uses electronic components to measure proximity, but the specific mechanism remains unknown. The vacuum tubes appear to be of unusual construction, possibly reinforced to survive firing shock. The battery appears to activate through centrifugal force during shell rotation. Suspected application: reflected signal detection, possibly acoustic or electromagnetic. Without a functional sample, determination of operating principle is impossible. They'd identified most of the components. They'd recognized the function. They couldn't reconstruct the design. Close, but not close enough. The weapon's secrecy was so complete that many American forces operating the fuses didn't fully understand them. Gun crews knew they were special ammunition. They knew the shells were killed without direct hits. They knew not to fire them over land. But the technical mechanism remained classified above their clearance level. Operational security required that even the people using the weapon didn't know exactly how it worked. William Sterling Parsons, the naval officer who'd supervised the proximity fuse's adaptation for shipboard use, never spoke publicly about his work on the weapon. After the war ended, he transferred to Los Alamos and joined a different classified project. On August 6, 1945, Parsons served as weaponer aboard Enola Gay, arming the uranium bomb during flight to Hiroshima. He manually inserted the explosive charges into the weapon at altitude, converting it from a safe device into an armed nuclear bomb. His proximity fuse work prepared him for that mission. Both involved making weapons function reliably under conditions where failure meant catastrophe. Parsons died on December 5, 1953, age 52, from a heart attack. His obituary in the New York Times devoted 3 paragraphs to his atomic weapons work. The proximity fuse received 1 sentence. During the war, he also worked on advanced ordnance projects. 8 years after the war ended, his most consequential contribution to victory remained too classified to describe in detail in his death notice. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.